I'm a president of the Simón Bolívar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Amongst Peoples. We are a space of exchange and production with the goal of building solidarity and based on solidarity to generate a new paradigm for humanity that is today facing a new crisis of the capitalist model. Today, we are meeting here to discuss specifically the issue of coercive unilateral measures or sanctions, as they are also known, illegal sanctions, which in the case of my country of Venezuela, it has been a tool that imperialism has used to subject the people from Venezuela to suffering. And we want to take advantage of this opportunity to talk about what these measures are, what is their legal background or framework they are based on, and what their effects are. What do they produce in the population? This initiative is organized hand in hand with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And now I give the floor to our friend Vijay Prashad, director of the Tricontinental Institute.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's a great pleasure for Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and our entire team spread out in India, South Africa, Argentina, and Brazil to be part of this particular seminar on sanctions, on coercive illegal sanctions on countries like Venezuela, but also 29, at least 29 other countries. Whether it's North Korea or Iran, series of countries around the world that are being suffocated. We at Tricontinental with the Simón Bolívar Institute are opening up a long process of study about the sanctions. This seminar is the first of this long process. Later in this month, along with Claudia de la Cruz and Manolo de los Santos, I will edit and release a book called Viviremos, Venezuela versus Hybrid War, which collects essays and interviews that investigate and look deeply into these sanctions, particularly against Venezuela. We will also be empaneling a tribunal to look very seriously at the effect, the social impact of these sanctions on the Venezuelan people in particular. This tribunal will be modeled on the tribunal created in 1966 by the philosopher Bertrand Russell. That Russell tribunal looked closely at the Western war, particularly led by the United States of America against Vietnam. The Russell tribunal studied the war on Vietnam and produced a considerable report that detailed atrocities and the pain and suffering experienced by the Vietnamese people as a consequence of that war. Following from the tradition of the Russell Tribunal, we will later this month empanel a tribunal to look at this hybrid war on Venezuela and later, sometime next year, release a report, a factual report, unlike the Lima Group's recent report on Venezuela, which was not factual, but based on mostly, it seemed to me at least, social media reports. This is going to be a factual report. So I'm glad you've joined us for this seminar. Again, this is the opening of a process of deep study about the social impact of the sanctions on Venezuela in particular, but also, as I said, on the dozens of other countries that are facing unilateral, coercive, let me put it quite plainly, illegal sanctions against these countries. So to get things going, I'm very happy to turn it over to the Deputy Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, Renata Portobugni. Renata, floor is yours.
Gracias, Vijay. Buen día a todas y a todos.
Thank you, Vijay, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. to the seminar, Let Us Breathe, Sanctions as Violation to Human Rights. We will have three parts in this seminar. We'll begin with the first part, which is geopolitical aspect of sanctions. The second part is on the social impact of sanctions. And the last part will be about human rights and the sanctions. Each speaker will have around 10 and 12 minutes to introduce themselves, and we will be coordinating amongst ourselves. Carlos, Ron, Vijay Prashad, and myself will be moderating the different parts. So then, to begin, I'll pass the floor to Carlos Ron, the director of the Simón Bolívar Institute.
Thank you, Renata. Okay, just to start this segment regarding the geopolitics of illegal sanctions, we have the honor of welcoming our friend and brother, Mr. Stedile, which is the leader of the landless peasants movement in Brazil, also representative of Via Campesina. Pedro, can you give us your reflections on these coercive and illegal measures? Thank you very much, Carlos. A big hug to everybody who are meeting or gathering now in this room, Mr. Vijay, Mr. Jorge, and our lady comrade, who I didn't know, and everybody who is following us on the internet as well. It is very important that we carry out this seminar, and I congratulate whoever had this idea, because in this way we start in a good way this anti-imperialistic World Week against imperialism, where dozens of countries and thousands of people will mobilize to reflect upon what imperialism means, its consequences for the peoples, and the need of fighting for the sovereignty of our peoples, of our countries. So, as a general introduction, I'm going to abuse of your patience a little bit, but it is important to understand the metamorphosis that has happened in the way imperialism acts. Take a look. We used to be familiar with classic imperialism in the 20th century. That classic sort of imperialism meant the need of industrial capital of the North, who needed to accumulate further capital, look in the South, markets of cheap labor and cheap raw materials. So they came to our countries with their factories, their oil refineries, because it was a need of the industrial capital. And if somebody would oppose that movement and expansion of capital, then they have the mariners, the military bases, and in some cases they promoted military coups. That was the pattern of how imperialism used to act in the 20th century. But since the 1980s, with new liberalism, we are now in a new phase of capital accumulation, which is based on the financial capital and in globalized corporations. So it's not an accumulation that has the factories as its basis. They brought together other ways of accumulating capital in the southern periphery. And among those forms, to broaden their exploitation, they included purchasing companies. They don't come with their own factories. It's cheaper for them to buy the shares of our companies, or what is already installed, let's say. And it's easier for them to become to expropriate the work of workers through a very subtle mechanism, which is interest rates. That is generating public debt, internal or external. So those the financial capital, they buy those papers, those bonds that are published by the governments, and the governments, in a legal and subtle form, transfer the wellness on the richness of the peoples through the payment of the foreign debt. And this becomes powerful mechanisms to exploit people's work without people getting to be aware of that. The next way of exploitation is through the dollar. As dollar has no parity with anything else, the Americans print dollars, they paint that paper with green, it becomes money, and those who use the dollar as a means of circulation, they're also transferring their wealth to the American imperialists, the North American imperialists. They always used dollars to finance their aggressions and the movement of their capital. Right now, they have obtained they have bought assets in Europe, and they will pay them with dollars, and the Europeans will get this green painted paper for their assets. Lastly, they use the world market. It's not our domestic market anymore. An international corporation is now globalized. That means that they have the manipulation of the world market. That's why the price of commodities is a world price. It's not based on the theory of value, neither on the cost of production. Corporations are the ones who establish the prices of commodities. How much wheat costs, how much powder milk costs, or any other commodity. So this is also an exploitation mechanism, because those economies that cannot produce at that price because their prices have their costs are higher, they go bankrupt. And the countries that produce at a cheaper price, they appropriate that extraordinary income that those other countries lose. Now, when with the crisis of capitalism and the mode of production, imperialists started looking again at raw materials and natural resources, because they need to protect their financial speculative capital. So we are aware that all around the world, they have looking for extraordinary profit. They come with their dollars to buy our natural resources, because they don't have high prices, because they are assets of nature. They buy water, they buy biodiversity, they buy petroleum, and now they have a perverse mechanism, which is the carbon rights, which is a piece of paper that gives them the right to speculate with the oxygen produced by natural forests. Look how crazy capitalism has gone, trying to get profit, and they do it buying and selling oxygen that are produced by natural forests where we find indigenous peoples living. The third point I want to comment is that before these new ways of exploitation, imperialism has also changed their forms of control. And it's not, there is no point of sending Marines all over the place or organizing military invasions, because soldiers have families in the United States, and there is a pressure exerted by civil society in the United States that they don't want to put boots in other countries to save the lives of their citizens. And all the latest wars where United States got involved, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq, they lost those wars, and they don't dare invade Iran because they know they're going to pay a high price. So the classic war is not an instrument anymore to maintain imperialist interests. So what they use hybrid wars now, as Vijay anticipated. And I would like you to read this book, Hybrid Wars. It's an English investigator. How did he write this book? He researched just documents of the armed forces of the United States. And with that investigation, he designed, which is the strategy of the American armed forces to defend the economic interests of their bourgeoisie. And these hybrid wars is a new way of ensuring domination to keep on accumulating capital. These hybrid wars means that they will exert an effort on the ideological war to control the minds and the hearts of the people. How do they do it? They do it through the internet, through the Facebook, through Google. Snowden, he blew the whistle saying that Google is part of the CIA efforts. So they share informations with the deep state and the CIA. So all of us who use Google, we automatically give our informations to the CIA, and the CIA operates to defend the interests of capital. Also, they dominate the press, and as part of the hybrid war, they start buying rulers. It's cheaper to buy rulers and government officers than it's cheaper than invading with troops. Look what they did with Moreno. They bought Moreno in Ecuador. Look what they did in Bolivia. They bought the Minister of War for $500,000, who is now Evo Morales, war minister, who is now living in Miami, as if nothing had happened. They bought judges in Brazil. They ousted Dilma, and they prevented Lula from becoming a candidate. And they used then lawfare, which is a new technique of the judiciary, to create a false, to exercise a false sort of law against the left. Why am I commenting all these ways of domination, which I recommend you read in this book, Hybrid War, or you will be able to read in the next Vijay book? That is because all these tactics of the hybrid war, they have employed against Venezuela. Venezuela, since Chavez hold power, is the lab of the North of the Americans to experiment each one of these techniques, and they all have been used against the people and the legitimate government of Venezuela. All of these techniques have been practiced, and in Venezuela, those which are described in this book, which was elaborated through the research of documents of the American forces in the army, they have been applied in Venezuela. So that's why I'm waiting for Vijay's book to see. They have been using the internet, manipulating the dollar. They have been using the internet. look what they've done in Venezuela with the exchange rate. What they did with Tariq, he was denounced as a chief of the international drug traffic, and people believed it. And now we know that the main witness was a CIA agent which helped Colombians to transport drug to the United States. So the accuser is the true culprit of the international drug traffic. It's good that this was made public and Tariq was now considered innocent. But so Venezuela is the victim, is a lab of these hybrid war techniques. And they amplify these techniques also. And why did Venezuela resist? As a Brazilian and taking a look from far away, I dare to say that the same tactics were used in Honduras and it worked. The same tactics were used against our bishop, who was who would have a bad word to say about Lugo in Paraguay, and they ousted her. They ousted Dilma, who was an honest woman, and she was ousted. And then they ousted Evo Morales in Bolivia. So why the tactics of hybrid wars did work in some countries, but it didn't work. They didn't work in Venezuela. I have a hypothesis that Vijay later on will have to prove in one of his books. And the hypothesis is that they didn't oust the Venezuela government because the Venezuela operated an alliance through the Bolivarian process, a protected alliance protected by Saint Francis, which is the most important saint in Italy. Yesterday, the 4th of October, was the day of Saint Francis. This saint alliance that brought together the people through their several ways of popular organization together with armed forces. And that generated a force that hybrid wars cannot break. So in those countries where this alliance didn't take place, where the people with their forms of organizations and the armed forces go different ways, the governments could be ousted, but there was no resistance on the part of the people, neither on the part of the armed forces. So try to keep this alliance and you will be will be protected by Saint Francis. On those times, the Roman imperialists used tactics that didn't work. And he, Saint Francis, with the peace and the alliance of the people, was the only that came into Jerusalem preaching peace. Okay, I have spoken too long already, so thank you very much, and I give the floor back to the coordinators. Thank you, João Pedro. We will reflect to this presentation that João Pedro has expressed right now. So the Chancellor of the Venezuelan Republic is going to take the floor now.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you very much, everyone here present, everyone who's organizing this seminar. As João Pedro told us, on the very center of this anti-imperialistic week of action that will, of course, be covered during this week, but it must be present every day and every year. And I am very thankful for João Pedro's introduction. He mentioned several aspects I wanted to get into, but he also shared a very good overview of the context from what we can see, what we can experience in the reality, as Marx mentioned, materialism, to study, or the same way Paulo Freire related to reality, the way he worked with people in the factories and in their territories to know what they went through. First of all, this week of action, anti-imperialism, must re-emerge and somehow to be retaken as a category. A lot of people think of it as something that belongs to the um, European an European vision of the 20th century, but it's actually an absolute truth. Sometimes, however, we know that the youth or some people that haven't quite understood what it means, they mistake it with the people of the United States, and that's not the case. Imperialism is a series of corporate, financial, economical interests that govern the world, govern the capitalist world, and they have political intentions and their political expressions, the most important of which is the United States government and their institutions. But there are also elements in Europe, also in our own countries in Latin America. Some countries even have both aspects, some institutions that respond to imperialism and others that don't. But the peoples, even the European people, they do not answer to imperialism. They may be alienated, they may be passive, but by nature, the human beings are against imperialism. They do not like to see people being oppressed by others, and they do not like conflict of war. So that's an aspect one must have very clear. The United States imperialism is, without a doubt, the strongest one, the most visible one right now. And it has become even more visible in the hands of the last 4 years, the rulers, however we want to call them, these eagles. But Mr. Trump didn't always continue the imperialistic policies of this historical moment, but the forms certain aspects that were still, with which they were still very careful. For example, by Bush, who still had a war that had no authorization by the UN. However, on the daily work, there was a lot of diplomatic care in Bush administration, and the same thing with Obama's administration, who of course had his own race, the color of his skin, but he was, despite this, involved in the putsch in Honduras, in Brazil. There was also the Arab Spring, the Syrian Spring. All of these things, everything that happened in Brazil had to do with Obama's strategy. But Mr. Trump hasn't just continued this policy of US domination, but it has also made it more honest. And perhaps even that is better. And let me say this with a lot of respect to our comrades from the Americas. The fact that we have visits from Mike Pence or Mike Pompeo in different countries of the Americas without a strong call to protest and to reject this presence. Just like João Pedro was saying, St. Francis was, and Jesus himself, they embodied a message of peace and generosity. Well, in the same way, Trump is the embodiment of capitalism. You saw him in the debate. He is arrogant, selfish, petty, racist, and he wants to dominate the world. He is capitalism itself. Now, what can happen if in the next election Biden wins or whomever? Then this new old man with his smile will be different, but they will continue. So the fact that we haven't had worldwide protests, that the United Nations have reacted against the US imperialism during Trump's administration, is very worrisome, because he was in terms of historical contradiction, he was the ideal figure to understand what imperialism is and to reject it in all of its different expressions. So now maybe they will be disguised as innocent and confuse a lot of people. This is something that may happen now, but let me now speak from Venezuela, from my experience as a part of Venezuela. During the years where we lost Chavez, these were very conflicting times. We had to try to understand the new moment of the revolution, of the how to give continuity to the plan that Chavez left for us. And the reconstruction of the new leadership was very complicated, especially during the first few years, whilst still resisting the aggressions of the US. In 2013 itself, if I recall correctly, during the assumption of a South American president, I remember that President Correa took me by my clothes to tell me that he had certain source in Ecuador telling him that the US thought Maduro would have 100 days and that was it. Without Chavez, Maduro had to leave. It wasn't viable anymore. Chavez's leadership would not have been enough. And that now, supposedly, it would be much easier to bring an end to the Bolivarian project. And then we had the elections. During this year in December, we won the elections with 75% of the municipalities in the country. And in January, we had all of different cases of violence. So they took violence to the streets, and then came the international criticism due to the human rights violation that created the conditions so that with the economic attacks, which was already in place but became even worse. We had then, for example, several banks, such as the Bank of America, different banks that didn't want to work with Venezuela anymore. So whenever we wanted to work with them, they said, no, well, no, this is impossible because you haven't reported on this and that other piece of information. They gave different justification for this, which were false. At the time, then, what we saw was a worsening of these aggressions. And the special rapporteur at the time, a person who sadly left us very recently, he told us that he noticed this since the year 2001, the fact that there were sanctions, these coercive measures. And I remember that back then the US prevented us from importing the tools that we needed for our military equipment from the US. This was the M16, certain different weapons. This was blocked entirely in 2001. And then came the greater aggression. In 2015, March 8, we're surprised by this executive order from Barack Obama with the famous declaration of considering Venezuela an extraordinary threat. And that was, in terms of the law, this opened the doorways for all of these different sections, all of the actions that they have done worldwide to block our resources and to persecute us. The foundation, the justification behind that, the reasoning is this executive order of Barack Obama. And of course, Obama was more mild in his forms, but Trump has meant an increase in the level of aggression. And myself, if you may allow me to speak in the first person, my own experience, for me, it was already clear that there was an aggression in place. But from my position as chancellor, we had in July 30th the national Constitutional Assembly that had already received so many accusations. We had the violence of the marimbas in 2017. President Maduro solved that democratically. We had the National Assembly, and that brought an end to this incredible violence. It was an immediate effect of the National Constitutional Assembly, and ever since then we've had peace. After the After we had a new chancellor, Trump threatened us with a military operation. He said it wouldn't be an issue for us to invade Venezuela. It would be very easy to invade them. We have troops all over the world. And in August 26, we had the first round of sanctions with our oil company. We couldn't easily use the resources of our companies in the US, and the assets of Venezuela worldwide were being restricted. And then began also the actions of this group, the Lima Group, which again is a modality of unilaterally. That's collective unilateral actions. They come together, different governments, to do what the US wants us to do. And that way they give it us a front of a collective action. The reason this group exists is to oust Maduro from the government, just like the National Assembly that now in January 5th will have a new session, just as this assembly had as a goal to also oust Maduro and bring an end to the Bolivarian Revolution. The damage that these sanctions have done, the written ones and the ones that aren't written, which is a result of this overcompliance, it's the terror of capital in terms of working with a country that might be subject to a sanction from the US. So even though in writing there might not be any kind of limitation, they may say, no, humanitarian aspects aren't subject to sanctions. But many times there have been letters sent to Mike Pompeo saying this is not true. Any supplier, be it of medication or of food, just the fact that this sanction exists becomes a deterrent, makes them want to avoid coming into negotiations with Venezuela. So we have explicit sanctions and also implicit sanctions. So then that's what has been the cost of this. And what is the economy of Venezuela? What sustains the entire Venezuelan economy? The oil sector, and the oil sector has been heavily attacked. How can this industry work when we cannot import the chemicals we need to process the different aspects involved, the different tools? This is prevented through every possible way. And they also try to prevent us from importing and exporting oil. So different distribution companies and transport companies have now refused to work with Venezuela. So then we also cannot import oil anymore. There have been studies made between researchers from Venezuela and the US that prove the impact of the sanctions is only comparable to the impact of a war, an actual war with bombs on the oil industry in the world. That's the reality we are experiencing right now. We have a reduction of a shrinking of the entire economy, and we also have less capacity as a state in Venezuela because we cannot import the input needed for production, the food, the medication, everything that the Venezuelan people need. If you have funds overseas or somewhere abroad, that if we are to agree with the proposals of capitalism, we have banks in Europe, in the United States, from the Central Bank of Venezuela, from our main oil company, we have 5,000 euros frozen in Europe and $5,000 frozen in the US. And they say the justification they give for this is to prevent Maduro to steal this money. What did they think someone would do with this money? But this money is actually to buy food, to buy medication, to buy instruments for farming, for life itself. This gold that is currently tied up in a judicial process in the United Kingdom, we asked for it this year, and we were even flexible. We said, don't give it to us, give it to the project of the United Nations for development, and then we'll see how Venezuela can agree with this institution so that we may use this to face the COVID crisis. How many people have died and how many people became ill because we were unable to use our own resources to confront the pandemic. And this is something that will be left not only in the memory of history, but also to the judicial process against this country and these sanctions. Luckily, we had China, Russia, Turkey, and other countries that have supported us and who have also received support from Venezuela. We have produced treatments, medication, protection equipment, masks. Just one mask to say in any country in this world, one mask is 0.53 cents, but for us it's $1 because we need to buy them through special distribution with a middleman. Is much more difficult, and this makes it more expensive because, again, as President Maduro says, it's not just a blockade, it's a persecution. They call the suppliers, they call companies, they prevent us from having direct links or direct relationship with Bayern, with Russia, with the important laboratories that create, that produce this medication. Our metro system, for example, it's from Siemens and General Electric, and these companies don't come to Venezuela because they are afraid. The medical teams, the medical equipment from Siemens, MRI machines in our hospitals, Philips, for example, they don't send technicians for maintenance because they might be sanctioned. So this is a criminal action. And as João Pedro had said, it's part of the unconventional hybrid war. It's an attack that's coming from every direction in many different forms with multiple fronts. It's a political war. Of course, it's political against Venezuela, against the revolution, against socialism. It's also ideological. And of course, it's economical, as we're mentioning right now, meant to block our progress, to make inflation a much worse. This is fundamental. It's a media war as well, and of course they concentrate the biggest companies, which then their productions become replicated everywhere else in the world. We had this defamation of Venezuela as a narco-traffic state. So there's a word to defamate us, to connect our state and our leaders to the absolute worst, to killers and to drug dealers, so that everyone becomes convinced, so that they can justify an intervention in Venezuela to oust this government, a supposedly evil government, and so that they can take control of the Venezuelan resources. And it's a real war in terms of militia, the CIA working in Venezuela, trying to kill our president with sharpshooters. It's also a real war in the conventional aspect, although we still haven't reached an open war in that sense. And God willing, we hope that won't happen, but we are receiving other kinds of bomb. When we are unable to import medication, that's a bomb that's falling on us and people die. When we are prevented from the import of food, that is a wound on the future of our children who cannot eat properly. And these are the problems that we are facing. We are in the offensive. Our president doesn't just sit still and complain or go to the United Nations complaining of the attacks we are under. No, we take steps forward. President is discussing right now a law against the blockade that would provide us with tools that goes beyond the conventional laws of Venezuela, which may allow us to have more flexibility in terms of economic policy so that we may go directly to the structures of popular power and give them also assets and trying to protect foreign investment in Venezuela despite the economic aggression of the US. So I don't want to take up any more time, but the proposal right now is that we may go towards international court of law for many reasons, but of course, lawyers need to determine a specific field of action. So we will be focusing on the international coercive measures or sanctions, however we may want to call them, and to bring capitalism and imperialism and their political faces as the accused of this process. These, including the countries of Latin America that have worked against Venezuela. They would not dare to face off against the US in that way. So that is why right now we need to create tools so that the people, not only the peoples in popular assembly of farmers and workers, but also including experts, professionals, so that they may all can reach conclusions in terms of the aggressions and the crimes committed by the US government, just to mention the political responsible of this. In February of this year, we presented we presented a document convinced that it can be proven by the court of law that these measures, coercive measures against Venezuela, as well as Cuba, Iran, Mozambique, and other 25 countries, that they constitute crimes against humanity, and they create a systematic, generalized attack against an entire nation. It is genocide, it's persecution, and that's why we have a case, a very clear case, for these forces that will be expressing themselves today against imperialism, and they can support this as well, be it with letters or in any way they want, with saying that they agree with the Venezuelan government. This is an international court of penal law where responsibility is very specific. Who signed the first executive order? Who signed the next one? Who speaks against Venezuela? What group of countries is against Venezuela? That's very clear. Even just looking into the social media, you can reach these conclusions by yourself. But we will prevail, and that's what I wanted to share here. With the same courage that was so characteristic of Hugo Chavez, we will continue working to solve the central problems of our economy. We have clear signals, even in this country of pandemic, of an increase in food production in Venezuela. We have signals that with the new legislation and with the National Assembly that works for the people and not against the people, the new National Assembly after January 5th, we will have more tools to strengthen the work with our allies, with Iran, with other countries. We will recover the oil industry in Venezuela and diversify our economic model. The oil-dependent model has come to an end. It continues being today the most important factor. It was the model imposed on the 20th century, but that's what they have used to try to weaken Venezuelan economy. And let me close now my intervention just as I look forward to hear from, I look forward to read the book from Vijay on hybrid war. I also recommend you read the book called The Art of Sanctions by Richard Levy. He was a consultant on the issue of sanctions for Barack Obama, focused on Iran. He there makes a confession that is to be studied. All worker men and women and every member of our community should study that. We can read there that these sanctions that are not part of the charters of the United Nations, they are unilateral and illegal decisions, illegal on the basis of international law. He says this very clearly, without euphemism. The goal of sanction is to cause pain. This is very clearly stated. And he says we must ID vulnerable sectors of the country. That's the target. There where they are at their most vulnerable, that's where they must be attacked, so that this pain and suffering generates the ideal conditions, for example, to accept an international intervention without protesting, or to rebel against their own government because of the consequences that they suffer as a result of the sanctions. And they also say that the only solution for the sanctioned state is to surrender. And you know, comrades, we, the sons and daughters of Bolivar, we do not know what it means to surrender. That is not part of our genetic code of struggle. This does not exist in Venezuela. Bolivar never would have surrendered under no circumstances. Chavez didn't even surrender to death. He continues on in the struggle with us. So this is a war of resistance, a long war, and we need to succeed in the world that the sanctions must be condemned and prevented by whatever means, and they must be considered as outside the law, and the people who impose them must be judged, and not the people of the governments that suffer them. So with this, I wanted to close, but still with a lot of hope. The situation in Venezuela is not much worse than what it was in 2006 or 2017. The scarcity we went through. Last year, they tried to impose the fake government on us through a lot of international pressure in the Security Council. And now, for example, with human rights, they say there is this so-called independent mission. Independent from what? It's not independent from imperialism, for sure. This mission that never came to Venezuela, they only worked remotely, and they reached conclusions that said it could be possible that eventually there might be crimes against humanity, and the title was still, there are crimes against humanity. They presented the support to the Organization of American States with the intention of creating a military attack to intervene in Venezuela. This was a mission of 19 countries that do not recognize the legitimacy of Maduro's government. This is a political tool, but we will not surrender to any political tool. We will continue working with the international community, with our diplomacy of peace, and no tool that uses human rights against human rights will be accepted by us. That's very important that you all know this. There are a lot of positive things coming for Venezuela this year. You will be surprised, and we know we count on the solidarity of the peoples everywhere. And I'd like to share the greetings from President Maduro. He's very much aware, and we embrace you from Venezuela.
Thank you very much, our brother Chancellor. Now I will give the floor to our sister Renata from the Three Continental Institute, so that she will introduce the panelists we have here today with us. Hello, thank you very much, Carlos, for conducting this first block on geopolitics. with the incredible interventions of Mr. Arreaza and João Pedro. Very valuable, this discussion. But we will start now the second part to discuss the impact, the social impacts caused by sanctions. We have the honor of having here with us Rebeca Madriz, which is the General Director of the Foundation Gender with Class. If she's ready, I'll give her the floor so she can speak to us. Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for everybody for this necessary anti-imperialistic campaign on the part of the peoples. I will comment some elements that have to do with the unilateral sanctions of the United States, how that affect human rights and women's rights. And we have to start with the Constitution of 1999, which incorporates the progressive program for girls and women, which will later be developed along the Bolivarian Revolution, and which has, in political terms, a very important item, which is the 25th of October of where Hugo Chavez declared the anti-patriarchal and feminist character of the Bolivarian Revolution. But the unilateral sanctions have impacted human rights, especially the right to health and to nourishment. And there is one aspect which I would like to incorporate, and they have tried to take us from the strategic aspect to very basic aspects. And there is a strategic aspects that the feminist Venezuelan movement has stated, advancing the human rights of girls and women, the conditions that we have submitted because of these unilateral sanctions. This has made our struggle for human rights for women and girls have been affected because of the lack of medicine, of food, and other items. But the feminist movement is one of the main supports of the Bolivarian revolution. And this hybrid war has the intention of demoralizing and demobilizing the political force of Venezuelan women, who are a political avant-garde. But as Maduro says, we are the ethic and moral reserve of this revolution. So I want to talk about some aspects regarding the pressures of unilateral sanctions on women's human rights. In the first place, we want to emphasize the right to health. We're talking about integral health and biopsychosocial aspects, which means the access to material goods which will let us live a decent life, which is now interfered by these criminal measures against the fundamental right of access to health services of the Venezuelan people, and making more vulnerable sectors which are found in a particular condition, like, for example, women with some type of handicaps, which now confront certain limitations. The coercive and unilateral measures are against the government, affect mainly the Venezuelan people, and this is observable through the persecution to prevent the Venezuelan government can negotiate with other governments to guarantee the purchase of commodities and foods, for example. In terms of health, some agreements have been suspended regarding with some companies in Italy, or which this is impairs the possibility of improving the health of Venezuelan children. Also, the Venezuelan feminine population, we have 9,500,000 women, and the fertility rate is of an important percentage. So the contraceptives in our people had managed a coverage of 22.5%, but with the distribution of wealth, these rights were universalized. So the access to anticonceptive methods was an everyday situation that the revolution universalized, and this was one of the fundamental guarantees that the revolution made possible, and one of the main aspects where the women feel the impact of these measures is when we had shortages of these contraceptive methods, and especially for women in their reproductive age. So these sanctions have an impact in the autonomy of women's sexuality, impacts the integral healthcare of women, and we become vulnerable in terms of being able to plan our families, which is an aspect that have relevant dimensions for the social, economic, and demographic policies of our country. Associated to this, like the early pregnancy and other aspects, are problems in Latin America. But if we put on top of this the unilateral sanctions, this becomes a lot more complex. Maternal deaths have diminished a lot in the country. But one aspect of symbolic dimension is the patriarchal and structural violence against women. Latin American societies are very patriarchal, but the frustration generated because of the precarious material conditions that are being imposed on our people turn to exacerbate the patriarchalism and violence against women. So the pressures generated by the context and these expressions in the household, especially on women, on patriarchal societies, against logic, home is the most dangerous place for women, and this is shown by the femicide numbers. But if that we sum up the constant pressure on the Venezuelan people, this exacerbates the pressure on women, and it exacerbates the violence on women as well. Also have to do with the sexual gender division of work, especially with the emergence of the care, because the criminal embargo is criminal in terms of the Venezuelan women have to augment their taking care non-remunerated labor. So in previous years, during 2015, 16, 17, the long queues to buy fundamental items have affected Venezuelan women. Venezuelan grandmothers are now becoming they're taking care of children because they have seen their parents migrate because of the hard economic situation. When this is combined with social distancing, these start that taking care of the ill and the children and the old, this falls on the shoulders of women. And this is a lot of psychological pressure and making women more vulnerable, and we are prevented from our right to leisure. Migration through economic hardships, the material conditions that the unilateral embargo impacts on the people worsen the economic hardships, and there is a connected effect, which is the mistreatment of women. And then we have femicides of Venezuelan women and migrant women, where they are received with lots of prejudice in the countries where they migrate to, because of the role that imperialist countries and the mass media are making public false news on Venezuelan immigrants. And the people who return to the country, 60% are women and 25% boys and girls. They would come back because of economic problems, and 54% came back because of the violence on women, on the migrant Venezuelan women. In the context of the pandemic, 117,000 people came back to the country in a legal way and 60,000 in an illegal way. And these pressures on the Venezuelan people affects the population, so that many people have to return to Venezuela because of the impact of the world campaign against Venezuelans. The right to decent income has been attacked as well through this hybrid war. Just to give you an example on what the impact has been of the Bolivarian revolution to eradicate poverty, in 2006, they created the mission, which was part of the first actions to materialize the 88th article of the Constitution, which acknowledges the work at home as an economic activity that generates welfare and produces wealth. So the women were then incorporated, empowering them. The state recognized that the minimum salary, which the beneficiaries of the mission got a $400 salary in 2006, 2007, and this was empowering women that they have had. And the women that went through this mission, they were in the avant-garde of the organizational forces of as political leaders and representatives of the people. So the impact this mission had was very meaningful. But nowadays, as a consequence of what has been said, we haven't got any income from our oil production. So this has affected the whole economy of society, and even social salaries to guarantee health and education, and to contain through social protection what Mr. Maduro said, the injuries of this war. So we have tried to prioritize collective rights. This is access to food and medicine primarily. These are some of the aspects that the product of this redistribution of wealth in Venezuela, which started in year 99, and women started to gain a better social situation within our community. This unilateral sanctions has had an impact on women, which has worsened their situation. So we share that the elements or the intention to reopen those situations of inequality in our people and generate more equality and affecting all the human rights of our population, but especially children and women's rights. This is what it's a crime against humanity, against the Venezuelan people, as the Article 7 of the International Court establishes, which has the Commission as a part of a generalized attack against a civilian population with the knowledge of that attack. Is deliberate, the intention of worsening the quality of life of the Venezuelan people, to look for the way out, to oust the system and to put in place a pro-imperialistic oligarchic government in our country. Finally, I want to say that the rights recognized for women and children on the part of of our revolution are running the risk. This war has a main target, which are women, because we are the avant-garde of this revolution and we are a pillar of this process. So there are media, psychological, symbolic, economic, and material means of this hybrid war against Venezuela, which intends to demobilize women and the Venezuelan people. Despite all this, despite the context of these circumstances, Venezuelan women are still the front line of resistance, and we have as a priority the fight for our sovereignty, because we are an independent nation, and we will continue fighting this embargo so the human rights of women will continue its progress as it was happening until we started feeling the effects of this unilateral illegal sanctions which try to breach human rights in Venezuela. It has been, we have received repeated threats of military intervention against Venezuela, which would be the worst scenario for women in terms of violence. As one of the most cruel mechanisms of using the women body as a price of war. So we're against that. That's why we are in the first line of battle to defend our homeland and our sovereignty. The main strong points is that we have inherited from the feminist tradition, Latin American feminist tradition, which has its center in the community, in the collective rights, and in the common good. And Venezuelan feminism is the main social basis with that, since the local committees of the people guarantee the distribution of food in the country, or the communal assemblies which are directed by women, or the areas of communal health care which have women at their front lines also. All of these are organizative instances where women organize themselves and resist the imperial aggression and the patriarchal aggression, and this has made our spirit even stronger. We demand, in terms of Venezuelan women, that they respect our right to be free and to follow our destiny and to further the social model that the revolution has established. We demand that the crimes against civil society in our country, in the framework of an imperialist project of recolonizing our continent, and which pretends to revert the rights that and the social advances we have reached. We call feminist movements of the world and of our continent, which are now the main force that mobilizes against neoliberalism to be to express our solidarity with our imperialist cause. The coercive unilateral sanctions are a violation of human rights, especially of women and children. And we see that the coercive unilateral measures have been translated into suffering, especially for the most vulnerable sectors of our people. We say that those coercive unilateral measures, they breach the right to develop and the right to peace of the Venezuelan people. And we say that these measures are the most criminal expression of the global dictatorship of our times. The only thing unusual and extraordinary that we find in Venezuela is the bad example which we represent for imperialists around the world as an alternative model, able to include in its fundamental objectives social justice. And the extraordinary and unusual in Venezuela is a people with a very deep political consciousness and a high capacity of mobilization and organization, which avant-garde is being directed by women. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca. This debate is very important and valuable and very well presented by you. Now, let's go forward, and we have the special participation of Hilal Elver, who was the special rapporteur of the United Nations on the right to nourishment and food. She's not occupying this post anymore, but we are very happy to have her here with us.
Thank you very much for this participation and inviting me. It's when I was a special rapporteur, which is I finished recently 6 years. This issue is one of the important issue in my reports that I constantly raised. As you know, there's another special rapporteur specifically on unilateral coercive actions. And unfortunately, we lost Idris Jazairi 6 months ago, a year ago right now. Now there's a new special rapporteur working on that. But we have been constantly working together because right to food and nutrition, one of the important area of human rights that directly affected by economic sanction, unilateral economic sanctions. This is not only food and nutrition, as well as you all know, important right to health, and they're very much connected with each other. And as you know, sometimes, for instance, Iraq war, after the Iraq war in 1991, the sanction against Iraq was a good example that the impact of the civilians population was much more severe than during the wartime. So generally, sanctions are produced kind of like a policy instrument, and the policy instrument that is more benign, and easier to handle it rather than conflict, kind of armed conflict, rather than invading countries. But in reality, actually, impact is deeper, longer, and significantly directly wrong targets. So it's a very important to discuss this from the perspective of international law, from the perspective of legality of this a policy instrument, because they call policy instrument, but it is not actually policy instrument. It's actually the way the post-colonial period attacking to developing countries that they don't like their ideological settings. That's exactly what it is. Because if you look at who is subject to sanction and who are the countries that presenting sanction, you can easily understand developed and powerful countries. As we know, United States of America is number one, and UK, European Union comes right after them. They use this economic sanction rather mostly political reasons, geopolitical reasons, economic reasons, and also ideological reasons. If we look at the whole thing about the way in which sanctions became really malign part of the political environment, it is a very serious case, and it has to be discussed in a wider environment. The one of the good things about the COVID-19, and during the COVID-19, especially in March, early March, which I was a special rapporteur still at that time, we special rapporteurs try to make it clear that during the COVID-19, economic sanctions are extremely serious, because we are talking about very, very important problem of the world, pandemic. As you know, right now, we are still in the middle of the pandemic. And during the pandemic, making economic sanction means that really criminal action against ordinary people. So I issued several of press releases, and also several of special rapporteurs issued together some press releases, and more importantly, High Commissioners of the Human Rights, Mrs. Bachelet, made a very strong, very, very strong statement against economic sanction. And United Nations General Assembly is always against economic sanction, because, as you know, General Assembly is much more democratic part of the United Nations, unlike the Security Council. So that was the one way, using the General Assembly and also Secretary General, making clear, which at that time Iran was very important, because they were under serious kind of COVID threat, one of the major countries that were affected by COVID, and they are also under the serious sanction. So that was one way opening the sanction issue in an international committee. It helped. And in my experience, I saw single-handedly and directly when I visited Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was a very interesting country, because we don't know, I didn't know before doing my research, that Zimbabwe was under economic sanction years and years, and because of the Mugabe. Since Mugabe came to power, and United States and European Union and UK issued the sanctions, the reason was very connected actually with the right to food. Our Lavia Campesina friend maybe knows very well the reason of first Zimbabwe sanction was Mugabe wanted to land reform, and because the land, significant amount of land was under the hands of white farmers, and the black farmers didn't have any right to access to land. So he did the land reform, and he transformed some of the land to the black farmers, and then UK and European Union and United States started to sanctioning. I am not saying that Mugabe is a perfect leader, because Mugabe, when he was doing, also made some kind of questionable decisions, gave the first to his own people, and they gave the priority that he was working with them and independence war against the colonial power. He gave them a priority, this and that. But then, even after the Mugabe, the consecutive leaderships were not a part of the global economic order. Zimbabwe is a very important African country in terms of food production. They have a great climate, they have a great land, and most of the land right now is not usable because of the conflict is still going on. What land belongs to who? At the same time, the sanction really made a Zimbabwean economy dysfunctional. Right now, there's a 600% inflation. 65% of the Zimbabwe citizens are food insecure, and they have only few hours electricity in the country. And the hospitals, when I was there, 90% of the hospitals were closed because doctors were not able to get paid. Only 10% doctors were working without getting any salary. So the people were hungry, but only people. When you go to supermarkets, it was very interesting. The food was totally available, but extremely expensive, which means not only availability, also accessibility of the food significantly impacted by sanction. Ordinary people have not enough salary to get the food. So malnutrition was a serious problem. Actually, malnutrition was a serious problem in cities, Harare, but not in the villages, because in the villages, still village people were able to feed their children in small plot, which is very, very small. So what I feel that I talked to elite of Zimbabwean, they were complaining about they cannot travel to London. This is not the way we talk about economic sanction. Supposedly economic sanction in Zimbabwe, because I know very significantly what was going on there, American ambassador talked to me and EU talked to me, and they said, well, you know what, only few people we are dealing with the sanction, not whole country. It was whole country, directly and indirectly. I think this chancellor mentioned about he used something explicit and implicit. It's a very interesting. It doesn't have to be only targeting 3 people. No foreign country comes and invests Zimbabwe. No bank system is working. No Zimbabwean can send a money to their family while they are working outside of the country. Basically, they isolated country. Because they isolated country, interestingly enough, COVID came later. That's a good part of the Zimbabwean sanction, actually. It's very strange. Now it's because, there's only one airplane Ethiopian Airlines can fly. They can only go very few places, almost no, because there is no money and there's not even gas to drive their car for their work. So how possible country that 60% people are food insecure, children are dying from starvation, and we still want to keep this American sanction. This is, from my point of view, crimes against humanity. It's a clear way of the crimes against humanity. And Venezuelans now, of course, rightly so, see right now they are going International Criminal Court, making their own sanction as crimes against humanity. What I'm trying to say, right now, we are not in normal situation. We are in the serious emergency situation. Again, another example, for instance, Cuba case. In 2018, there was a big typhoon and Cubans impacted by this natural disaster. Same thing in Zimbabwe. Typhoon Idai in 2019 had a serious kind of damage. What happened? Humanitarian aid was not able to come in. You know what they say? Oh, we have a humanitarian window. You don't have a humanitarian window. There is no such thing. They don't, humanitarian organizations, they don't want to go there. Or, for instance, if they give the neighboring countries $2 billion, they give 100 million to Zimbabwe. And also money never comes directly to the government. They come to the NGOs. NGOs get huge chunk of money and ordinary people get very little. So sometimes yes, money goes, but money doesn't go to the right people. Those goes indirectly different places. In Venezuelan situation, we see in New York Times every day the pictures that children are starving and this and that, but no one asks why. If you go to the American people, you ask them, what is going on Zimbabwe? Answer is, oh, Zimbabwe, what is going on Venezuela? Well, the leaders are very bad. They are socialists. They don't feed their own people. Cuba, same thing again. What is happening? Cuba is helping entire world with their medical service. And they're under serious kind of sanction since 1960. So it is not acceptable. I understand American leadership general, they are using sanction, but Trump is using way, way beyond than earlier leaders. But still, again, I don't have a big hope that if Biden comes, this sanction will be different, because as I said, the free market economy is very important. If you are not able to access multinational companies to the Venezuelan market, they won't suffer. That's all about it. So opening the global economy, making like other countries, making them net food importer, then Venezuela will be not under sanction, but it will be under the invasion of the kind of very major corporations and industrial agriculture come in. You know, the Cuba was able to protect itself. Agroecology was a very important way of a Cuban agricultural system. This will change if the sanction lifted. So it's a big way to work for the countries. If one day sanction goes away, they have to keep their independence, their self-sufficiency. So after the sanction, they should not go dependency. So that's an important policy situation that we have to be very carefully discuss. Let me stop here because I think it's very, we are late, and any question I'm ready to answer. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Hilal, por su
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hilal, for your contribution to the seminar with this humanitarian and integral perspective of the processes in this country. Now, to close this seminar, we have now the honor to invite William Castillo. He is the Vice Minister for Anti-Blockade Policies in Venezuela. So if you're ready, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon. Very thankful for the Simón Bolívar Institute, for the organizers, for the Tricontinental, and all comrades, ladies, men and ladies, which are in this important meeting, which make it possible to visualize the true situation of Venezuela and the crimes against humanity that are being committed against the Venezuelan people through the embargo against the economy, which is a way of producing pain that would provoke a change of regime and would destroy the democratic process in Venezuela. I would like to refer to an element, which is a proposal that Maduro has put forward through the economy ministry. The president has told the Constituent Assembly the discussion and approval of a law bill to confront the embargo. In this history of the last 5 or 6 years, Venezuela has been resistant against the embargo. First, we had to understand what happened to us, to understand that we had a hybrid war, that our assets were persecuted and were taken away from our hands. It started with Obama. The banks called co-responsible started from stopping servicing Venezuela, stop serving the state-owned Venezuelan companies in abroad, and this has been getting stronger, and with Trump, this got even worse when a total embargo against the Venezuelan economy was declared. This produced a deep impact in the economic indicators, in our quality of life, and it has injured our income. For example, Venezuela got, since the impact our economy has suffered in 2014, we received $56,000 because of selling oil and minerals, on mineral ore. But now we got a drop of 90% of our income in the last 5 years. That means that we have lost $30,000 million or $30 billion every year during the last 5-6 years. This is what Maduro has stated before the Constituent Assembly. What will happen with any economy of Europe or of the developed world if they stopped earning $30 billion per year during 5 years? What would happen to this economy? What would happen to their women, their children, their sick? What will happen to their indexes of economic growth, their rates of consumption with the value of salaries? So the Venezuelan economy has been devastated because of the sanctions of the United States for the systematic, aggressive policy to siege our economy, and that has prevented our state-owned Devoe, our oil company. We haven't been able to sell our products. So it has been prevented from their assets. We have lost around $400 billion, I think. It has been, so the PDVSA has been threatened in Europe, its assets in Europe and in the United States, and we now confront a legal war because of the executive orders signed by Obama and Trump. We are confronting a situation of absolute embargo to the Venezuelan economy. This is the first thing we have to understand when we are talking about the possibility of, in the next few days or next few weeks, our Constituent Assembly will discuss and pass an anti-embargo law, and the resistant measures and confrontation of the embargo that other countries also suffer, like Iran and Syria. that have suffered sanctions on the part of the United States for years, and looking to the flexibilization and giving capacity our companies to build alliances, to get income in the country, to prevent our central bank in one day was robbed, you could say, $400 million that were deposited in the United States. It's a direct account of our company until 2019. Our accounting, we had $7 billion blocked in various international banks where our companies had deposits in Europe and in the United States, and some of them in Asia as well, and of course in Latin America. So our oil operations have been persecuted. Donald Trump signed an executive order that prohibits the transactions in gold. We have 80 tons of gold which have been blocked in London. We are in a judicial war against that. Today, we had a decision in one of our appeals in London where it was decided that the process to get to a conclusion on who should manage this gold, which is Venezuela, in London, they acknowledged of a government that doesn't exist, which is the fact that the United Kingdom has a ambassador in Venezuela, and Venezuela has an ambassador in London, and this farce orchestrated by Mr. Guaido has justified the embargo against Venezuela. So the great impact that our economy has suffered, but as Mr. Chancellor has explained, and as the ex-UN rapporteur has now said, this has affected our social rights. All the indexes that where Venezuela was at the avant-garde of Latin America regarding nourishment and our childhood health have suffered, all of them. The import of food has been affected as well. Our import of food has dropped 75% in the last few years because banks don't want to process our payments, because we have had an embargo from Mexico under the ex-president Peña Nieto, or from Colombia under the government of ex-president Santos and the current president, Mr. Duque. They have blackmailed our commercial policies, and they have established tariffs, in different high tariffs for commodities being transported to Venezuela or that trade with Venezuela. They have they have sanctioned the captains of boats who are not Venezuelan. There are many times Europeans who are captains to transport petroleum, which are contracted from international companies. Well, these people personally have been punished. Such is the level of persecution. Such is the level of cruelty, planned cruelty, designed precisely, and punishment through the financial system, through direct and indirect mechanisms of pressure that the American Treasury exerts on banks, business people from Venezuela and from around the world have been threatened and have been punished directly because they were trading with us, with Venezuela, practicing the free trade, as the United States says should be practiced all over the world. So before the situation, after analyzing the extreme situation and exceptional that our economy is going through, the President of the Republic has proposed the Constituent Assembly the creation of a legal instrument that will give responses strategically to the embargo. So we are discussing a law which will enable us to facilitate administrative processes, to facilitate at the national and international level, facilitate our operations, to deviate from the embargo, both in the judicial, financial, and trade spheres, to look for ways that we will be able to use our assets, to use our gold, so that Venezuela can get inserted again in the international markets. But we have found in that criminal network spaces where we can get some resources. Today, the priority is to recover our capacity of obtaining income, precisely as the law says, for the objectives of strengthening the mechanism of salary compensation and strengthening the salaries of workers of the private and the public sectors in Venezuela. So the policy of protecting labor, supporting salaries, which has been the economic variable which has been more affected through the economic aggressions against our country. Another objective is the purchase of medicine, food, medical products to serve the healthcare system in Brazil, which is universal and free. And it also has the objective of having direct subsidies through a technological platform, which is the Patria platform. That you will have direct subsidies to mothers, single mothers, mothers with children that have special handicaps, the senior citizens, the retirees, so the most vulnerable sectors of the population, those who are suffering the greatest impact of these unilateral sanctions. And part of the resources that we can generate through alliances with the countries that support Venezuela, but also the sectors of private sectors in the world that want to contribute to the development of Venezuela. These resources will be canalized to the strengthening of basic utilities, that is to say, water, electricity, communication, because the lady vice president said that the sanctions are like bombs that fall on public utilities, on salaries, and on the quality of life. We don't see those bombs, we don't see the explosions, but we feel it's their effects. When a country declared the war to another one, the first things to do is to try to cut the refineries, the access to food, access to financial resources, to deteriorate the conditions of defense of that country. So what the United States has done is to bomb our economy, bomb our social inclusive model, bomb the quality of life of all citizens, no matter what their political positions are, to bomb social indicators, and to destroy the great advances that Venezuela attained during the first decade of this century. So in this context, we are working with this new bill, which will through a new National Assembly, we will do a revision of all our legal structure. Venezuela has to get prepared because the sanctions is a bipartisan policy from the United States, and it's a strategic policy. And of course, that Trump was very interested in destroying Venezuela. But it's a policy of the North American state, of a supremacist elite that thinks that Venezuela and Latin America should be their backyard and should be colonies of the United States. These policies won't stop at some point of night. Maybe they will be modified. We hope to convince of the need that the United States reflects, that we go back to respectful relationships in terms of diplomacy and of trade. But we believe that this policy is established there to last many years. So we need to reconstruct our legislation to adapt to modern mechanisms of economy and generate an answer that will enable us to defend our sovereignty, to maintain our self-determination and independence as a nation, not to fall on our knees, and not to surrender, and not surrender to North American imperialism. We will defend our sovereignty. We will defend our social model, which is democratic, inclusive, participative, so we have thought of a legal instrument, which is a state response. It's a response that I hope will be bettered because of the judicial power, because of the different powers of the state, so that we will be debated, but all the powers of the state of Venezuela, all the democratic powers of Venezuela, will revise this law, will improve it, and it becomes an element of union of the productive sectors and the whole country to reject the embargo, to build a new economy. This is a strategic line that in terms of economy, the president has launched as a leader of this revolutionary process. And we ask the world, we know that there are many participations. The law opens the participation of the popular power and the productive sectors, so that many assets, for example, which are the product of the international traffic of drugs, for example, that are now under legal property, that they can be passed over to the social organizations so that can benefit our society. So we hope to be able to empower our people, give participation, direct participation to our people through swift mechanisms, and to build a new productive model that should be born from the grassroots, from our peasants, and which has to contribute to the development of the country. And we are sure that it will contribute to a strategic defeat of the embargo and the imperialistic policies of the United States towards our country. So I thank the opportunity of transmitting these ideas and to inform you, because there's going to be a campaign saying that we are violating the Constitution, that we are deconstructing the state in Venezuela, but we are planning a law to answer the criminal embargo with the support of our people. Thank you very much. Thank you, William, for your presentation, which gives us a lot of points to reflect on, to understand what the repercussions of the sanctions are in the Venezuelan people. Thank you, everybody, for the presentations on the impact, the social impact of sanctions. And because of the time, the advanced time, we give back the floor to Mr. Prashad, which is the director of the Tricontinental Institution on Social Research.
Okay, that was an amazing seminar. I think I'd just like to say that firstly. Secondly, I think the seminar has been a good first step in our long-term project to analyze and understand the nature of the sanctions regime. We've, I think, established today with very good presentations that the unilateral sanctions, coercive sanctions against countries like Venezuela are done basically on political grounds. This has very little to do with international law and certainly almost nothing to do with advancing the agenda of human rights. I think we're starting from the premise that this is a political assault on countries that certain countries like the United States find objectionable, or at least they find their political developments to be objectionable. In other words, these are not sanctions policies that are grounded on advancing the agenda of the United Nations Charter of 1945. In fact, what the presentations have shown us today is that these unilateral sanctions, this policy, is against the UN Charter, which is why every year the UN General Assembly, in the specific case of Cuba, every year the UN General Assembly votes overwhelmingly to end the blockade on Cuba. Every year. Every year since 1960, I want to say this repeatedly, every year since 1960, almost 180 plus countries, 185, 187 countries out of 193 vote to end the blockade on Cuba. That means that the vast majority of the world's countries, member states of the United Nations, understand that these forms of unilateral coercive sanctions are against the spirit of the UN Charter. This last year, the US ambassador to the United Nations said that the United States has the sovereign right to determine who it trades with. So she said that it's by the US protecting its sovereignty that it wants to compromise the sovereignty of countries like Venezuela. This is a very important point. It means that there are conflicted sovereignties in the world. We need to take this up seriously as we study the policy of sanctions in the world and what they're doing. The next step for us is the release of the book Viviremos, which will come out in a few weeks. Then the Simon Bolivar Institute and Tricontinental will impanel a tribunal, which is along the grain of the Russell Tribunal, to closely study the sanctions policy. And I very much hope that everybody who's presented today will once more come and testify before the tribunal. Your presentations today will be closely studied by members of the tribunal. They will already be entered into the record of the tribunal, but we would like you to return and be questioned by the tribunal members if they have questions about what you have presented. And we would like the texts of your presentations to enter the record of the tribunal. This tribunal's final report will be published sometime next year. I'm very grateful to work with Carlos Ron, the president of the Simon Bolivar Institute, with Renata Porto Bugni, the deputy director of Tricontinental. Happy to have today as our interpreters Ana and Enrique. And thanks very much to Daniel, Luciana, and Pilar for working to make sure that everything, at least technologically, goes flat out straight. It was a great pleasure to listen today to João Pedro and Jorge as usual, to Hilal, Rebecca, William. Brilliant presentations from everybody. We're so grateful that you joined us today, friends. Don't forget to follow the Simon Bolivar Institute on all various important social media platforms as well, Tricontinental. This is the week of struggles against imperialism. There are many events coming up. On the 9th of October, 20 publishers from around the world will be releasing a text of Che Guevara in 20 different languages. So look out for that. This is a historical event. This will be published on the 9th of October, the day that Che Guevara was assassinated by the CIA. Just remember that he was arrested 2 days previously and he was killed in cold blood without a trial. That's called a murder or an assassination. We are trying to start a custom of having the 9th of October be the International Day to abolish the CIA. So join us for the other events during the International Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggles. Thank you so much and see you later.